The Security Weekly News is live on Tuesdays and Fridays at 12 o'clock Eastern Time most every week. I try to scan and produce a quick look at some major stories to help you keep up with what's going on in and around the industry in a short format. Myself, Jason Wood, and other guest commentators provide greater insight every week. I'm Doug White, and I hope that you will look for the Security Weekly News in all of your favorite podcast catchers and subscribe for the latest content.
Your organization is building and updating business-critical web applications faster than ever. And with so much pressure to move fast, you may find yourself making trade-offs between innovation and security. Now you can build fast without sacrificing security with Invicti, the zero-noise application security platform that helps your dev, sec, and ops teams work together to secure every website, web app, and API. With unparalleled accuracy, coverage, and automation, Invicti scales like no other AppSec solution. Invicti AppSec with zero noise. Visit securityweekly.com/Invicti. Welcome to RSA Conference 2023. We're recording live from Broadcast Alley here in Moscone West. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Patrick Vandenberg, Director of Product at Invicti Security. Hello, Patrick.
Hey, Mike. Thanks for having me here today.
Wonderful to have you here this afternoon. And what I wanted to, I host the Application Security Weekly, and you have an AppSec or an Application Security Indicator report. What have you been indicating? Tell me more.
We do. Great way to open it. So Invicti we've been doing this report for 9 years. And actually there's two flavors to it. So the spring report is database, so mining the data from our customers, all the non-private data, of course. And then the fall edition is survey-based. So we survey the industry, and then there's a different perspective.
So internal, external, kind of.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in this one, 9th year, we've done this report and just launched. And you know that the theme of this one came out to be scan more, fix more, reduce your risk. And I'm sure we'll chat about that in a little bit, but. The data came from 1.7 million scans and over 1,700 customers. So we were able to expand that data set for this year. So from that, we feel we've got some good insights from it.
There is. And scan more, that doesn't sound necessarily new to me. I think I've heard scan more for 10 years, 20 years. But there's also, I think, a nuance in there. We're not just supposed to scan more just for the sake of scanning. There's a benefit to this. Tell us why.
Yeah, there is. So in the big takeaways part of the report or the perspective on the report, we saw scanning increasing. And you're spot on, right? Like the idea of scanning more, that's been around for a long time. And if you can mature to a point where your scanning is so frequent, we're approaching the application security version of monitoring, right? Like you're shortening that window of exposure, shortening that window of lack of visibility towards an almost monitoring state. You're in a much secure position. But our main takeaway here was we saw scanning frequency rise on a number of different dimensions, right? Both in total scans, but scans per target. So any way you slice it, it's going up. And that drove us to also seeing vulnerabilities, severe vulnerabilities ticking down. So it's the first time, even though the notion's not new, it's the first time we have data to support that premise. And that, for us, was a significant takeaway.
That's a nice indicator, to be quite honest. And I think you mentioned 1,700 customers. There's got to be something that's, in addition, like what leads them to have that scanning either be more frequent or that scanning turns into, in practice, in actuality, fewer vulns? Is this like a maturity thing? What's an angle here?
Yeah, so there's a couple of conversation points in that question. So if you walk through the process with me for a second here, you scan more, you're going to ultimately find more vulnerabilities.
Devs are going to be busy.
Regardless of what the trend is, you're going to find more. And as you find more, what happens? Well, the collaboration between security and development gets more reps. Developers get more reps seeing a particular vulnerability or a set of vulnerability. And just like an athlete developing a new skill, the more reps they get, the better they get. You put a new worker on an assembly line, the more reps they get, the more efficient and productive they're going to get. Well, it's the same thing for a developer. If they've seen a remote code execution vulnerability for the 5th time in a week and a half, they're going to ideally recognize that doesn't need to be in their code anymore. But they're going to get better at the remediation. They're going to get faster at it. They're going to learn and understand it. So the idea is scan more, find more, your processes get better, more efficient, and then the vulnerability starts to decline, and you reduce your risk.
Yeah, I like that processes aspect too, because I think, hopefully, I don't think you've said this at all, this isn't AppSec coming out as the drill sergeant yelling at developers to do 20 push-ups. That's the type of reps, that's the exercise. If 20 years ago we were saying scan more, that's probably why we failed to fix a lot of vulns, because we were just saying fix everything. So how do you see that in the modern apps now?
So, I mean, there's a great conversation there because, 20 years ago, just scanning once was a big deal, and that fostered a lot of friction between AppSec, who knew what needed to happen, and devs saying, no, I'm building apps over here. What are you talking about? Security is not my issue. That's yours. Well, we've progressed a long way, but unfortunately, we're now in an age with cloud-native application development and velocity of apps and updates of apps that we're at this point where we've got to shorten this window of release from the developer's hands.
Gotcha.
The longer that reaches back to the developer, the more friction there's liable to be in these fast-paced development release cycles. So if we can automate that scanning back into CI/CD pipeline, and get a real-world functional security check back to the developers more in their day-to-day life cycle, we're in a much better position to collaborate, engage, and support security at the same time, not disrupt and support what dev's mission is. So we think that's the direction.
That makes sense. I think you kind of answered this following question I've got already, but I'm going to re-ask it to poke it a little bit differently. You've got this report. A VP of engineering looks at it, or a CISO looks at it, or some leader on the AppSec side. I don't think the takeaway is we should just be scanning more. That's not what you're saying, but what should they be actually taking away from this report?
So I'm going to bring up this term shift left.
Okay. All right.
With full recognition that
I haven't rolled my eyes yet.
Yeah. With full recognition that many have gone past that single dimension of shift left, and it's the infinity loop. So full understanding, but for the purpose of understanding the concept that we're trying to share here, let's just simplify it down to
fair point.
We're trying to get DAST scanning, so web applications, API scanning, further left in that initial cycle. Where it's more organic for developers to, see code, get their SBOMs, and let's get a functional check on the security side of things. You're much more effective to do that. So we're seeing an uptick in shift left for DAST methodologies, but we're also seeing more of a shift right. And people might say, well, what are you talking about? You can't get more right than production. Well, a production test 20 years ago was just a single check, and it was set and forget, done, never looking at it again. Today, what we're talking about is that getting to continuous monitoring. So not just an annual or quarterly compliance check, but if I can get that application, which is changing on a very rapid basis, if I can get a weekly, and in some edge cases maybe daily, check on it because it's a very critical application, then I've almost got a production monitoring state of my web assets, and which, as we know, the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, web.
Lots of web in there.
So 70%, of the incidents started with web assets as the initial attack vector.
Right.
So I think this is a maturation of the application security space, and although, yes, conceptually people don't like shift left, DAST shifting both left and shift right helps the VP of engineering in the long run.
And I think the way you position that too is that security is actually accommodating development in this case. Or following along. They say development is releasing every day.
Yeah.
How come we're only doing our compliance scan once per quarter or once every month? We should be scanning along with that.
Yeah, that age-old concept of, is it security driving this or is it compliance driving this? And we did see prior areas where it was security and then compliance came along, and that's what was driving the business. Now it's both. Like you can have both here. But I think one thing that's been true is you're only successful if there's a partnership between AppSec and the development organization, and so it absolutely has to be collaborative. Neither one is going to be successful without it, so it has to be kind of an open, positive mindset.
So then looking forward either to the fall or maybe even next year, the 10th year of this, or let's say the 19th year of this, how optimistic are you for the future? Do you see this extending these trends into something particularly interesting?
Well, I mean, in our industry slice, we saw manufacturing as a huge outlier, like about 3x scanning rates of other industries. And, you look at pandemic and going digital, and so there was a rush to exposing some of the functionality in the supply chain into the digital spectrum. You can see a need to apply security for something like that. It could be coming out of log for Shell era where we saw an elevation in scanning rates and stuff. Yeah. But for whatever reason there, we did see a positive surge forward, and we saw a subset of manufacturing customers adopt the scanning and CI/CD pipeline. So looking forward, if we see more of that, then hopefully we'll see more of this, what we saw in this report, which was a 19% downtick in severe vulnerabilities. That's a positive step.
Music to my ears.
Fingers crossed that's what we start to see in the 10th and 11th edition.
So is there something, looking at the report then, is there something the other industries could be taking from manufacturing, or is there another external influence or way they can catch up that 3x as well?
Yeah, I mean, as soon as you adopt automated testing, you'll catch up pretty quickly. But it's the decision to get there. And so we're hoping there's a bit of a leader effect from the manufacturing industry that we'll continue to talk about. But I think there's about 7 industries that one thing that I thought was quite notable they had a 4-year steady annual increase in their scanning activity.
Okay, so not a blip. Yeah,
that's not a blip. There was 2 industries that were the inverse of that. We haven't been able to figure that one out. We'll continue to monitor that side. But when you have that many industries and not erratic, like steady year-over-year increases, that tells us something, that they're on the right track. And as more of the enterprise segment starts to adopt that automation, I think we're going to see more momentum on that trend.
No, that's really cool. And I wonder, it would be cool to see what the next Verizon DBIR looks like from their industry overlap as well, because everybody's got the web apps, but hopefully everybody has the secure web apps too.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the ideal.
So there is now those critical vulns have gone away. I just want to ask: is there still one that's just hanging out there that won't quite disappear? Or is there? You mentioned like RCEs.
Yeah,
or something like that.
That's one of the call outs. So teams only have the bandwidth really to focus on the critical and high severity vulns. We know that. So the prevalence of the mediums and lows are high because nobody's paying attention to it. But they're still there. They still need attention. And in the case of remote code execution, really low prevalence.
Okay.
So on one hand, somebody could dismiss it, but it's critical vuln. So it only takes one to blow up a business. And the concerning point about it, even though prevalence is really low, is that there is a steady uptick for the 4 years. And a 40% surge awful low levels. So, somebody could say statistically that's not really impactful. But when you start to back it up and say, okay, it's increased every year for 4 years, then it's worth noting, it's worth paying attention to, and it's our duty to call that out and keep an eye on that.
Yeah, so I guess a CISO, rather than having to practice writing up, we take your security seriously, they could we read your report seriously, and we'll take some of its recommendations to heart, perhaps.
Yes, hopefully.
Well, Patrick, this has been a great conversation, and you and I, in fact, are going to talk again in June on the Application Security Weekly podcast, so there's a lot more here to unpack.
We are looking forward to it.
Yeah, looking forward to speaking with you some more, Patrick, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike.
If you're interested in learning more about Invicti Security, visit securityweekly.com/InvictiRSAC. And stick around, we've got a lot more coming on the live stream. Welcome to RSA Conference 2023. We're recording live from Broadcast Alley here in Moscone West. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Karl Triebes, SVP of Product Management and the GM of Application Security at Imperva. Welcome, Karl.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
We love having you here because a topic I wanted to talk with you about, I think you wanted to talk about as well, is business logic. Now, business logic is one of those things that everybody just says, take care of business logic. And it's 2 words, and That's about it. I think we need a better definition at least, or what does business logic look like?
Yeah, when developers build applications, that's what they're focusing on is the business logic, the code that runs the business or runs that application. So as opposed to like attacking something like with a signature, like a SQL injection or other type of thing, the business logic attacks tend to be very focused on the specific weaknesses of the logic of the application. And so in order to do that, though, typically attackers have to go in and try to surveil and actually understand the application, map it out, understand how data is traversing the app, how are users accessing, what does the authentication look like, are there open areas, what is the schema, and all these things, and then based on that, they're able to take action based on that. So when we talk about business logic, that's what we're referring to is kind of all those pieces that come together from the developer, and that's become that very fertile ground now for attackers to go in and mine. Absolutely. Because you really get the keys to the kingdom once you're in there.
And I think it's always been a fertile ground, hasn't it? Because even, as you mentioned, like a SQL injection, there are linters, there's ways to detect that in code. We have known patterns that this should have been prepared statement, et cetera.
Absolutely.
Business logic, that is workflows. That's the state machine that honestly takes some human thinking to as you were saying, to surveil, but as well as to like, is this secure? How is someone going to take this apart? That's what humans are there for.
Absolutely, yeah, and that's the big challenge too, because developers typically are constantly changing the application.
Right.
And then it's complicated because it's not like just one person typically working on something. It could be tens, hundreds, thousands. You could be pulling in all sorts of different open source, connecting it in different ways. And you can build these very rich applications. However, developers tend not to be very good at security, right? They think through, okay, they're there to make the application work. And I know because I'm a developer by trade. And my focus always was, let's build it, let's make it fast, let's make it work and get it out. What you don't think about is what are all the things I need to do within these very stateful big applications to ensure that they're secure. And if you look at, just go through all the CVEs that come out on any daily basis, you can see how many applications have these, all these vulnerabilities. A good one is like Log4j, for example. That's a great example of something that really got rooted out of the business logic of the application, if you ask me. And there's many others out there. So they're not going away. It's just you need to come up with a strategy on how to defend and mitigate the impact of attacks against the business logic and the applications you use.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the attacks that are targeting the application, because from a developer's perspective, as you said, honestly, those state mechanisms, those workflows also get complex. One person really can't keep that all in their head.
Right.
And so attackers come and find some of those surprising ways, perhaps, that, I didn't think this was going to be abused in this manner.
Exactly, and APIs are a fertile ground for that. And the reason they're so fertile is that as opposed to like your traditional web apps, traditional web apps pretty much control your access to the application, or at least manage it pretty well. You check boxes, you have form fields and things like that, and then it translates and you go to your back app, and a lot of times you'll have protections and other mechanisms there that kind of mitigate anything there. Well, the APIs bypass typically all of that. Many times they're accessing databases directly, and so they don't have the same mitigations. And also, these APIs are also trying to do things differently than the web app. They're trying to provide access to a lot of different types of data. It's not just things that, a curated experience using a web form. And so as such, having these very complex changing APIs in the environment, it's much easier for attackers to go in and, find the vulnerabilities, first of all, in the APIs themselves. So figure out how they can mimic a valid user and then start to access these different backends and aspects of these things and see, okay, now I understand the schema. Well, wait a second, this object here, I have access to an object that I shouldn't have access to, right? Like a BOLA exploit or some function or something like that. Once they get in there, they can get deeper, and then eventually they can root around to other systems as well, right? Because also once you're at that layer, typically in your application, you wind up being able to find other ways around in the infrastructure.
Go find some more data. Yeah,
so
exactly.
It's a really enticing place to go mine, and that's why we see like last year, alone, we saw about 17% of attacks against APIs were business logic attacks. And on top of that, another 22% were some sort of automated attack as well. And that's just growing. We see that growing every day. And so it's just becoming that rich area for attackers to go in and mine and get value and be destructive.
To me, honestly, I also like the business logic because that's where creative thinking goes too.
Absolutely.
And you were describing about the APIs. There are mobile apps, they'll be backed by APIs, but often attackers can go in and poorly design mobile apps. They'll grab the secrets out of that. So they have the API key. So now you've got, is this API, is this a mobile app talking to it, or is this the botnet that just so happens the API key, or the hacker with the API key interacting with it? And how do you distinguish that? I think it becomes one of those questions that surprise developers, isn't it?
It's a really good question because one of the things we saw last year, and we have a bad bot report that we're publishing here. We do it every year. It's coming out in another week or two. But one of the things we've seen is that basically the mobile browser emulation, the attacks from that are growing quickly because in part, you look at like Apple and others, they put all this obfuscation technology in, right? Basically to protect privacy, which is great, but it also protects the hackers, right? And so it's much harder to then look at behaviors or other aspects of what you're doing to kind of root out these headless browsers and these headless mobile browsers or mobile agents. That's another big area, versus being able to detect humans. So that's one of the big areas of like of bot detection is how do I validate who the person is as things become more increasingly more difficult to detect. And mobile is one of the big areas. In fact, I think 60% of all application access now is over mobile devices. So as a percentage now, it's much larger than just your ordinary browsers, if you look at it.
Yeah, and think if we look at browsers, they're basically the new operating system. Same with mobile apps. That's in the sense of nobody needs root anymore. They just need access to Mike's valid credentials or Mike's browsing session or mobile session to get his data, for example.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to say it. It's become kind of the operating system of the internet, basically. In fact, one of the ways I look at a web application firewall, I think of it as a platform. Because basically everything's being transacted over HTTP or GraphQL or something like that, right? And it provides that platform for managing those protocols. But then on top of that, you start to layer then more specific aspects of the application, and the business logic components of that always reside on that. And so in the past, it always says, it's a TCP stack. No, it's really the web stack, and then it's the application stack that sits on top of that.
Well, when we start to talk to developers, I want to avoid being able to say, like, just write secure code. Don't have business logic mistakes. Those are nice to say, but I don't think that's actually helpful. So how do we give developers the idea of you've given some ideas of what business logic attacks are, what they might look like. What are some of the ways to either expand on that or to help developers protect their applications from these types of attacks?
Yeah, I mean, there's the obvious things you need to do with an application, when you're building it. And that is, the simple, I need to test it, I need to validate it. And, one of the things I always advise is that you build your tests before you actually write the code for the application, so you do test-driven development. And those are just good hygienic principles. But then it starts to boil down to, how do I manage 100 developers all aggregating and testing, putting their code together and doing that? And there's mechanisms like A/B testing and things like that, but that still doesn't get at the heart of the issue. And so then you got to start bringing in things more around conformance and validation and that. Okay. And that's actually, so when you look at API security, there's really two major areas that we see our customers addressing. One is kind of the compliance side, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then, of course, there's just the straight-up security side, protecting things. On the compliance side, what they're asking for is not just, hey, we have this open banking initiative, we need to protect APIs for that. They're saying, you know what, I want you to detect when there's changes in the APIs, and then if those are not valid per policy, I want you to block those.
Interesting.
And then what I would like you to do is, as you're discovering the APIs, the schemas, the endpoints, the data, I want you to build essentially a test platform that my developers can use, run against that, validate that, and if it doesn't conform to that, then they can change their code. And that's what we're seeing out there. And so there's that dev-centric side, and then there's kind of the I'm going to protect it side, if you will.
Yeah, and I think that is, I always get nervous saying that we're going to block this, we're going to turn off your access, because that feels like a tough negotiation to have with the developers, a source of friction perhaps between that AppSec side and DevOps teams.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you don't want to block the progress. Basically, you don't want to stop the business, right? At the end of the day, they're there because they're writing code that supports your business goals, and so you don't want to stop that. In fact, it was kind of like what happened early days of the web application firewall market, where companies started, in fact, back in the day, our release product did just positive security logic. And great, blocks everything. The problem is as soon as you change the app, it blocks that.
Yeah.
And that was not acceptable. And so we had to develop mechanisms that allowed that tuning. And so it's the same thing with APIs today, is that yes, you could put an absolute block, you add a new field, you do anything, boom, we're going to block it. That's not going to fly. So what you want to do is, instead of surprising developers, you need to be able to insert into their workflows with low or no friction, such that they can validate, do this, run through their automation, and then build the app, and then know that they've done everything they can to ensure it's the highest integrity possible.
That makes sense.
That's what you want. It's what I've learned is if you get in the way of developers, they will find a way around, and then that'll create a hole, and then that'll be a problem. And so it has to be seamless. Is what I'm saying. Yeah.
No, and that makes sense. And I think that speaks to the idea of, you mentioned like GraphQL, for example, or just detecting what's changing in an API. And GraphQL, we're not going to see the SQL injection style attacks against that. But we wouldn't want an API change so that it's suddenly a query can return everybody's information rather than just the current user's information. Those are subtle changes, but those can have drastic effects.
No, and you're absolutely right, is that it's anytime there's a change in that underlying technology there, then you create opportunities because the developers aren't necessarily used to that, and then they open up, based on that ignorance of how it works, it creates those opportunities for those types of flaws. And that's the problem. That's the thing that's hard to stop. And it's an iterative kind of best practices oriented thing, like we were just talking about, that you go after that. But you're absolutely right. And there'll be new ones. There's other ones that are coming along.
There will be new ones. There's always new.
Oh, AI is going to create all sorts of new fun things, isn't it? So.
Well, so speaking of, you have the bad bots report. You've been doing this for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Was there something that was either a surprising bot on you this year, or maybe if there wasn't, is there something that is coming up in the next few years that you suspect is going to appear as a bot on those reports?
Yeah, no, nothing surprising this year. Just growth, and when we look at like bad bot growth, now about 30% of the traffic on the internet's bad bots. That's what it comes down to, and we're seeing things that we expected, like the rise of those attacks against the business logic. API exploits have gone up massively. Just because it's like such rich ground. But, and then the other thing we see is that evasive bots. And these are bots that, are trying to emulate human behaviors, with mouse moves, and they're evasive, and they're rotating their IP addresses, and they're coming from different regions.
Behavior type of attacks.
Exactly. And so it's, and an average attack will have like 200,000 IP addresses, from these different, and so they're coming from all over, and so each one is kind of trying to do their own thing and try to piecing it together. And I expect the sophistication of those to go up significantly because, as we were talking about earlier, the bot, the code that's driving these bots today is sophisticated, but it's not reentrant or learning. It doesn't learn necessarily. At least on a very limited basis it can.
Right.
Now, just imagine you start to turn loose a generative AI system that has the ability to learn in ways that it's difficult for humans and piece things together very quickly, and then go back and retest, basically resurveil, and keep putting that picture together and doing it very quickly. And so that's the challenge is that since they can do it very quickly, you have to then start to develop mechanisms that can piece that together and proactively block it quicker.
Respond just the same.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so I just expect that to now kind of exponentially become more difficult. CAPTCHAs. I think CAPTCHAs, I've said this before, I think CAPTCHAs are dead. I think, a year from now, CAPTCHAs is going to be a useless thing. Yeah, I know.
Yes.
They were the worst thing ever to begin with, and now...
Even the humans don't like them. The machines are going to realize soon enough that they hate them too. But if they can solve that so we get rid of CAPTCHAs, it sounds like a good success story.
Yeah, well, it just means we have to have other mechanisms, and so maybe waiting rooms or other things you just have to do.
Yes, indeed. Well, Karl, we don't have any other mechanism to check with you're a human or a bot, but I think you haven't been evasive on any of these questions, so I think you're pretty solidly human. Thank you for all these.
All right, well, hey, thanks for having me here today. This is great.
Wonderful. Thanks again, Karl. And if you'd like to learn more about Imperva, their work on bad bot reports, check out securityweekly.com/ImpervaRSAC. Thank you.
All right, thanks.